Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We have a very interesting topic for you this afternoon. And luckily we're the first day, so everybody's nice and bright and bushy-tailed, not brain dead, and ready to go. You know, mainstream medicine has taken the stance that the only true condition of low adrenal function is Addison's disease. And at the same time, we've got hundreds of medical papers and research papers coming out talking about other incidences of low cortisol and the manifestations. And so it's a problem. So this dilemma has caused me to make this presentation to explore the key question of how is the state of adrenal function different from Addison's disease. Definition of Addison's disease, just as a review for you, because I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. Addison's disease is a primary or chronic adrenal cortical insufficiency, an insidious, usually progressive disease resulting from adrenal cortical hypofunction. If we take a definition from Sejal from 1920, we find that Sejal says functional hypoadrenia, his word for what we now call adrenal fatigue, is the symptom, the complex of deficient activity of the adrenals due to inadequate development, exhaustion by fatigue, senile degeneration, or any other factor which, without provoking organic lesions, in other words, not Addison's disease, or their nerve paths, is capable of rendering the secretory activity. They first appeared in literature in 1855 with Addison's disease, and in 1898 with Emile Sargent in France with adrenal fatigue, insufficiency of the adrenals, as his paper was called. Now, this non-Addison's low cortisol state has been around for a long time, and it's had a lot of names in the literature. And some of them you'd see would be adrenal insufficiency, neurasthenia, functional hypoadrenia, hypoadrenia, the French name insuffisance sur adrenal, sorry to butcher that French, subclinical hypoadrenia, hypoadrenal corticolism, subclinical Addison's hypoadrenia, minor Addison's, adrenal fatigue, and two you might also add to the list is simply low cortisol, and now relative adrenal insufficiency. So by many different names. And unfortunately, there's been some kind of confusions because you'll find writers writing under hypoadrenia or adrenal insufficiency, and one set of writers will be talking about Addison's disease, and another set of writers will be talking about this non-Addison's disease. Now let's do a comparison of these two. And first let's go by comparisons of cortisol signs and symptoms. Cortisol deficiency signs and symptoms, to be more specific. We can see that if you look at the screens that we have hypotension, hypoglycemia, decreased glycogen storage, all occurring with both of these illnesses, being more severe with the adrenal fatigue or the low cortisol state than with the Addisons. We see muscular weakness and feebleness occurring almost always with Addison's in the more severe types of low cortisol or adrenal fatigue. Both of them have resistance to infection, although they're not always present with adrenal fatigue. Both of them will have decreased resistance to trauma, decreased resistance to stress, and in the more severe cases of myocardial weaknesses with adrenal fatigue, but fairly commonly and very severely with Addison's disease. We'll see circulatory failures in Addison's disease, where we only see that in the most severe cases with adrenal fatigue. And of course, we'll see ACTH that gets many times normal level with Addison's disease. And if you see that in adrenal fatigue, it's a high normal to slightly high. It doesn't get into 2, 3, 4, 5 times normal like it does with Addison's disease. You'll also see increased beta-lipotrophin, increased melanocyte stimulation, increased pigmentation of the mucous membranes of the skin, and spots on the face or forehead with the people with Addison's disease. But you don't usually see that with people with adrenal fatigue, only in the most severe and only occasionally. Let me go back. So these 15 most common symptoms, we can see that 10 are shared by, in both. Of the 4 that aren't shared, that we usually see, those are related to skin pigmentation. And of the one that's not usually done, it's ACTH, and it's not usually measured in adrenal fatigue. And when it is, it's usually high normal to slightly high. So the chief differences in the 10 shared symptoms in the severity, which is less. So the difference is mainly in the severity, not whether it occurs or whether it doesn't. Now look at a comparison between Addison's disease and adrenal fatigue as far as signs and symptoms go. The early signs and symptoms of Addison's disease show profound fatigue, and we also see that in adrenal fatigue, except it's more severe, it's more mild. We see a muscular weakness as an early sign of Addison's disease, and we rarely see that, but if we do, it's only moderate in adrenal fatigue. We see that in the early stages of Addison's disease, it's benefited by rest, as is with adrenal fatigue. But as the adrenal gland becomes more eaten away by the autoimmune process or by the infectious process of Addison's disease, then rest doesn't any longer benefit the person. So they're not rejuvenated by rest at all, whereas they are with adrenal fatigue. There's orthostatic hypotension in both of these. It's just more severe with Addison's disease. Then as we get to the frequent signs and symptoms of Addison's disease, we see that anorexia and nausea are almost consistent throughout Addison's disease, but they're occasional with adrenal fatigue.